Hi, and welcome to STS1451, Body, Mind, and Health. This course is about medicine and society. We're going to cover a lot of subjects from the history of medicine all the way up through today. We have one day reserved for talking about the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. That's the Thursday before your final exam, and you guys will have the opportunity to tell me what subjects you want to focus on for that conversation. But we'll have other opportunities during the course of this very, very condensed semester where you can write about comparing our readings about the history of medicine to your current experience if you want to. I'm going to launch into our first lecture here. As I said in my announcement, lectures and readings supplement each other. So you cannot simply watch a lecture and get away with not doing the readings. I'm not going to cover our entire readings. You have to do both. I suggest you watch the lectures first because I can help you know what to zoom in on in your readings. All right, some keywords, concepts, and names from lecture only. These are the kinds of things that you're going to be responsible for understanding on quizzes and your final exam. Linear narrative of progress, apothecary, homeopaths, hydropaths, heroic doctors, Thomsonians, galvanists or electrotherapeutists, Samuel Christian Hahnemann, Samuel Thompson, Margaret Cleaves, venesection, the American Medical Association, primary source and secondary source. Some words from our reading that you will also be responsible for in all of your assignments include illness and biopsychosocial model. Those are in bold because they're the most important terms. We're going to use them all term. But in order to understand our readings, you should also be able to understand Kleiman's understanding of disease, sickness, the biomedical model, and biological reductionism. If you have any trouble understanding your readings, you should contact your TA or I as soon as possible. So what do you think might have changed about the practice of medicine between the 1800s and today? Since unfortunately we can't meet in person, I don't get to ask you and hear what you have to say, but I imagine for a lot of you, you imagine a timeline that looks something like this. In 1800, no one knew very much. Scary. In 1900, some inventions and discoveries probably improved the success rate of medical procedures. And now it's 2020, Jetsons era. We know so much, and every year we learn more about curing disease. This might have even been more accurate if I said 2019, because I think we now see the process of creating medical knowledge is a little bit more complex because we're in the middle of a pandemic, but that's another story. We're going to challenge this linear narrative of progress. Did you already notice how today's readings challenge this narrative? Our skepticism about linearity does not mean that nothing has changed. Over the next 3 weeks, we will study a few parallel trajectories. So over that course of time from 1800 to 2020, there were big changes in specialization in medical education. There were a lot of benefits, but also some limitations to new discoveries, as we're going to see, especially at the end of this week and the beginning of next week. And there were changes in the conception of the patient and his or her relationship to medical expertise. This last point is probably the most important in today's readings, but you're going to see these themes throughout the semester. So changes in specialization in medical education. Do you think the profession is more or less specialized today than it was before 1860? That's actually a really difficult question to answer because there are a ton of specialties before there were any standards. So while the profession is highly specialized today, the concept of doctor emerged in 1858 in Britain, and it brought together a few different specialties under one aegis. The profession of apothecary, physician, and surgeon became one word, doctor. Meanwhile, other subspecialties were still really popular in the US, including homeopaths, hydropaths, heroic doctors, Thomsonians, and eventually even electrotherapeutists or galvanists. So I focus on the US, by the way, because that's my area of specialty as a researcher, but I hope that you recognize that there will be different cultural perspectives depending on what subculture or nation, race, or ethnicity you're focusing on, and I do include some variety here. So the major sects in the US include homeopaths, as I said, hydropaths, heroic doctors, Thomsonians, and electrotherapeutists. Homeopaths were really prominent in the mid-19th century thanks to Hahnemann. He experimented with diluted, harmful, naturally occurring substances and theorized that a plant that caused symptoms in healthy people would relieve symptoms in sick people. This is weird contrapositive logic, and basically he was diluting poisons. You might think of The Princess Bride if you've seen that movie about building an immunity to iocane powder. It's sort of that kind of a practice. Today, some people perceive homeopaths as quacks. That critique is not new. The American Medical Association formed in 1847, and they wanted to differentiate regular doctors from sects like homeopaths. So even before doctor became a professional title, it was a word that was used, and they were trying to isolate the expertise of the doctor in order to gain cultural authority. And that cultural authority is really important because your patient has to trust you and trust that you know something that they don't if you want them to take your treatments. Nonetheless, homeopathy remains influential. Even Hahnemann has hospitals named after him and a monument in Scotts Circle, Washington, D.C. So one of the problems with the linear narrative of progress is the idea that you had one old idea that was wrong and bad, and you got rid of it, and now we are enlightened and we know more. That isn't really the case. We actually integrate aspects from these different sects into mainstream medical practice, and over the course of the semester, we'll see how that works. Hydropaths were another major sect. The name says it all. They believed in the curative power of cold water. Popular between the 1820s and 1850s. This is a little medical diagram from 1842 called Hydropathy, the cold water cure. If you've ever been told to even though they focused on cold water, if you've ever thought of the curative powers of a bath or Epsom salts, those are things that hydropaths discovered that became integrated into mainstream medical knowledge. Heroic medicine is aggressive interventionist medicine that was an ancestor of today's medical philosophies. Think bloodletting by venesection, which literally means taking blood out, opening veins, or by leeches, purging, which means making you vomit, or sweating. This was a sect of highly educated doctors who trained in the best colleges. So what you studied in medical school in the 18th century and early 19th century was basically how to remove humors, get blood or toxins out of the body by really aggressive means. And you could think that it makes some sense, because if someone has a rapid heart rate and then you remove a lot of their blood, their heart rate goes down. Stethoscope is a really old technology, and one of the few ways we had to understand what's going on inside the body at the time. So it seemed like what they were doing worked based on knowledge at the time, but it also had some major problems, obviously. This is the sect that accidentally expedited George Washington's death. This is my little cartoony leech here, but heroic medicine was super aggressive and it could kill you. Another major US sect was the Thomsonians, inspired by Samuel Thomson's 1822 book, A New Guide to Health, or Botanic Family Physician. This sect was interested in herbalist treatments, and it valued egalitarian knowledge sharing over college training. We're going to study a primary source from this in a moment. And the Galvanists, or electrotherapeutists, tried to apply electrical currents to heal ailing bodies. Benjamin Franklin experimented with galvanism. This field, really interestingly, was largely coeducational. There were equally many women and men involved in it until the discovery of the X-ray, when it really gained prominence as an important science, and then the women were pushed out by men. But at the beginning, women were inventing machines for experimenting with electrical currents on the body, and Margaret Cleaves was a really prominent woman, and just evidence that some of our ideas about women gaining medical expertise later are not, in that linear narrative of progress, they're not quite accurate. There were women practicing in a lot of these different sects, and then they were pushed out, as we'll see in a few days in our lecture on the Flexner Report. So take a wild guess of which group of professionals had more credibility. I've already kind of told you. It was subjective, whereas medical professions of Northern Europe developed in context of initially divided profession with an inbuilt ranking system. The American medical profession developed around and out of general practice. So in other words, doctors were considered experts because of their interactions with patients. And having a degree, which the heroic doctors had, and there were also board certifications for galvanists and electrotherapeutists too, it didn't matter as much as your reputation. People would know you and know that they could come to you. And if, a homeopath had treated your family and you felt a lot better after you saw them, you'd recommend them to your friends. So credibility was really subjective at the time, and that's something that the American Medical Association was trying to change and standardize. College training that was once reserved only for the heroic doctors became the standard, decentering the patient-doctor dyad and emphasizing scientific theoretical knowledge. Let me unpack this a little bit because it's really important and this relates to your readings. In the beginning of the 19th century and even earlier into the 18th century, the doctor's credibility was entirely built on their experience with patients. It was a binary relationship where the doctor would have to understand the patient really well and make decisions based on that patient. But when credentializing becomes important, this is how you get to biological reductionism. Medical schools started emphasizing knowing a lot about the science and the biology and less about thinking about the patient as a full human. And this is something that went all the way to one side. We became pretty biologically reductionist. And now we have a turn back where a lot of medical schools today make sure that you are able to understand your patient as a well-rounded person. The biopsychosocial model that Kleinman mentions is something that you'll also be taught if you go to medical school. So what are some of the ways that renewed emphasis on college level medical training might be a good thing? And what are some limitations of this change according to you and according to our readings? Obviously, college level medical training means that you're not just given arsenic for no reason. We have controlled trials. We'll read a little bit more about trials later in the semester. We're able to develop things like antibiotics that are really important. But as I mentioned, it also can reduce the role of the patient in the doctor-patient relationship, and that has some effects that we'll see through our readings this term. Even though doctors were gaining credibility and sort of standardizing into colleges, the public perception of medical school was not always positive. This is called the Philadelphia Physician Factory, and you can see it just looks like a complete madhouse of violence. So doctors actually had some negative connotations. They were known to dig up corpses because they needed to experiment on bodies in order to understand anatomy. They experimented on slaves, as we'll see with our readings on Friday. So those are a few more of the limitations of the switch to the medical scientific model. If we're going to study what good came of advances in medical science, we also have to think about the bad things that emerge from this shift too. Although education standards have gotten more rigorous, remember that this class requires you to challenge any facile notions of linear progress. To challenge these presumptions, we will analyze different representations and perspectives on medicine. So you might be wondering, why does analysis matter? We're talking about facts. And if you're in a biology class, you're going to learn about facts like, here is your large intestine, here's your small intestine, here's what they do, these are facts. But when you're actually interacting with patients, there's a lot more of an art to it. There's science and art working together, and that's why analysis matters. So you also might be wondering, what is analysis and how is it different from judging? You can have a reaction. So you might read something, especially if you're looking at something old, you might look at the hydropaths, for example, and think like, well, that's crazy. What would cold water cure? Maybe it helps reduce fevers, but what else can it do? You might have a gut reaction, but I want you to challenge your own assumptions and look back to the text or image and think about what prompted that reaction. Did the text or image have something in there that made you skeptical? Or are you just judging based on your own internal bias? As historians, we need to do the best that we can to try to set our assumptions aside and read historical texts on their own terms. Factors to consider as you analyze things include context. So why was this published? Audience, who is it for? What are they doing to try to convince those people? Content, what is it about? Form, What details, metaphors, or rhetorical appeals comprise the text or image? So the rhetorical appeals are logos, logic, pathos, emotion, and ethos, credibility. And then explain why you think those elements are important on their own and why they're important to the larger issue. So why they're important to the larger text or to the history of medicine in general. Analytical arguments have a particular structure. They have a specific detail as the subject of a sentence because you're talking about what a detail does. And then they have an active verb that identifies what that detail does and why it matters. Before we practice, let's discuss the difference between a primary source, a document that you analyze, and a secondary source, a document that you use for information. Our class readings are secondary sources. I'm sorry, there's not a closed parentheses here. I'll fix it in post. So a secondary source is something that you're trusting for information. It might be an encyclopedia, it might be an academic article or an academic book. One of the things that we read today came from Sheila Rothman's Living in the Shadow of Death. So she's analyzing primary sources in here. But if I quote her in order to talk about the fact that, you know, I think she says 1/5 of the people who moved west in the US moved because they were seeking treatment from tuberculosis, which is a staggering number of people. If I'm quoting that as a fact, I'm using it as a secondary source. If I'm analyzing how she structures her argument and wondering why she emphasizes individual patients over other things, I'm reading her as a primary source. The source itself is not primary or secondary, it's how you use it that makes it primary or secondary. So just to repeat, if you're using it for information and you're not questioning it, it's your secondary source. If you're analyzing it, it's your primary source. So now let's look at our primary source. This is from Samuel Thompson's New Guide to Health that I mentioned before. There are 3 things which have in greater or less degree called the attention of men: religion, government, and medicine. In ages past, these things were thought by millions to belong to 3 classes of men: priests, lawyers, and physicians. The priests held these things, the things of religion in their own hands and brought the people to terms, kept scriptures in dead languages so that the common people could not read them. Those days of darkness are done away. The scriptures are translated into our own language. Government was once considered as belonging only to the few. Common people have now become acquainted with the great secret of government. All men are born free and equal. While these and many other things are brought where common people can understand them, the knowledge and use of medicine is in great measure concealed in a dead language, and a sick man is often obliged to risk his life where he would not risk $1. And should the apothecary or his apprentice make a mistake, the sick man cannot correct it, and thus is exposed to receive an instrument of death instead of that which would restore him to health had he known good medicine. It is true that much of what this day is called medicine is deadly poison. So as you're reading a primary source, you should pay attention to different things that stand out to you. I noticed this parallelism of triplicate: religion, government, medicine, priests, lawyers, physicians. We can't miss this deadly poison. That emphasis is important. And I'm going to show you how I would analyze this. So make sure you understand the whole text or passage. It's really important that you really understand what the author is going for and why first before you dig in. The main points of Thompson's passage is that medical knowledge should be readily available to patients. Hopefully you got that from that excerpt. So now that we understand the overarching point, look for details that stand out to you. They could be interesting, anomalous, confusing. They could stand out for any reason. I mentioned that he compares medicine to religious and political knowledge. He calls medicine deadly poison, and he uses a linear narrative of progress to describe religion and government. So religion went from priests keeping knowledge to themselves to sharing it with common people. Government went from being held in the hands of the few to democracy, with the idea that all men are created equal. So once he has that parallel between these 3 areas of human knowledge, then there's the implication that medicine should also, like religion and politics, get into the hands of the people. So now I'm going to ask, so what? Why does this matter to the specific piece or to the history of medicine more broadly? So why does Thompson compare medicine to religious and political knowledge? This detail is related to the last one I noticed, the linear narrative of progress. In a paper, I grouped them together, like I just said, by drawing an equivalence between religion, politics, and medicine, and suggesting that the former two areas have evolved to enable public participation. Thompson makes it seem natural, inevitable, and progressive that medicine should become better understood by the masses. So remember I said that we need an active verb. My active verb here is makes it seem natural. This is what he's trying to do, and how he does it is by drawing the equivalence. That's the detail from the text. He calls medicine deadly poison. So what? This detail creates a sense of urgency by hinting that it is dangerous and deadly for the masses not to understand medical knowledge. So now we've practiced analysis a little bit. Hopefully this will help you when you analyze your own primary source later in the week. So why did he do these things? It helps support his ultimate goal of democratizing medicine. How does it relate to our discussion of illness narratives? Because he focuses on the importance of patient knowledge, which is the key that binds our readings together from this week. So notice that I keep asking, so what? I ask why it matters to Thompson, why is he doing this? And then I ask how it matters to us. This is something that you can do in order to be an effective analyst, is to keep asking questions. Don't just make one point, but keep thinking about why it works, why it matters. The so what question is the most important part of analysis. Looking forward, the next two readings are difficult and theoretical. Give yourself enough time to read them attentively. I'm actually going to make a little video to help with our first reading, just to guide you through how to read something that hard. Don't be upset if it's hard to read. These things were not written for college freshmen or, high school students. These were written for advanced experts. You will be able to make sense of them with work, and you should feel proud of yourself when you do. I want you to go ahead and take a look at the description of paper 1 to give yourself some time to ask questions. And don't forget to respond to your peers on the introduction and illness narrative discussion board. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing what you write, and I will talk more soon. Enjoy your day.